Hello everyone. In this video, we will try to understand the constitutional development from 1858 to 1947. This development we must understand in the context of revolt of 1857. Revolt of 1857 changed everything, and after revolt of 1857 there was a change in approach, right. So, when we prepare this constitutional development after 1858, we have to understand that what exactly changed after 1857 revolt, and in that context also they started giving us, they had to give us some concession, constitutional concession. Overall, when you prepare this topic, we have to remember that after 1857 revolt, they wanted Indians, you can say, as their partners. They wanted to associate Indians in the administration, and therefore they started talking about improvement in administration. They started talking about good governance. They started talking about representation, Indian representation, right. And now they were more interested in representation of Indians, particularly loyal Indians, right. So, when you see this development, you will see that development started in 1858 when they passed what you call, right, 1858 Act for Good Government in India. And in this act, we have to remember that in this act there was no major change, substantial change, right, in the administration, particularly in India. What they did, they abolished the dual system of Pitt's India Act. If you remember, I mentioned Pitt's India Act, and I said that in Pitt's India Act the dual system started, board of director and you can say court of director and board of control. So, this dual system was abolished in 1858 Act, and then there was a Secretary of State and there was a Council of India with 15 members to assist that Secretary of State, and in India now Governor General was called Viceroy, right. So, 1858 Act was a new beginning. They started talking about good governance. Is this okay? Then after 1858 Act, what I said the policy of association, right. Technically they are using this word policy of association. So, now they wanted to associate Indians. So, in that context they passed 1861 Act. When we prepare 1861 Act, you will see some new changes. First important change was that now, as they were interested in associating Indians, they started including, right, some Indian member as non-official member, right. You will see some inclusion, right, of Indians in 1861 Act, right, in the so called legislative assembly, right. So, 1861 Act, inclusion of Indians. 1861 Act, portfolio system they started developing, portfolio system, one department, one man. So, portfolio system also started in 1861 Act. And then in 1861 Act, they started what is called a decentralization process. Now, this, right, you can say power to legislate was given to, you can say Bombay and Madras presidency also. So, you will see that in 1861 Act, right, you will see this kind of changes, right. Then after 1861 Act, you must remember that there was a national awakening. there was arousal of a new consciousness, national consciousness. There was a pressure on them. What kind of pressure? Pressure to, you can say, allow responsible government. There was a demand of responsible government. And in that context, if you remember, 1885 Indian National Congress was also formed. It also started demanding some constitutional reform, and result of this demand was 1892 Act. So, third important development was 1892 Act. In 1892 Act, there was a demand of election, there was a demand of responsible government, there was a demand of more function, you can say legislative function, but 1892 Act was not very successful, right, in catering, right, to these demands, right. Of course, there was some increase in, you can say in Indian, in the number of Indians, of course. Then of course there was some new function added, like now Indians, right, now the members can ask, right, you can say question, right, particularly on public matters, and then they were given this power to, right, you can say discuss budget. So this kind of function of course allowed, but election, right, word cannot be used for 1892 Act. Nomination process, particularly those loyal yes man, they were nominated in 1892 Act. So 1892 Act was not, right, you can say related to responsible government, right. Then after 1892 Act, as you all know, rise of extremism, right, and rise of extremism of course paved the way for, right, a new demand for what? Swaraj, right, demand for Swaraj. But two important development, one development, Muslim League was formed in 1906, and then Surat split 1907, and because of these two development, they were not interested in giving responsible government, right. The process of increasing the number of Indians continued. Now the Imperial Legislative Council, right, of course became enlarged, of course in the Viceroy's Executive Council Indian member, but they were not interested in giving responsible government, and they wanted to weaken this nationalism, and therefore in 1909 most important provision of this 1909 was what? Separate electorate. Now this provision was not to strengthen nationalism, this provision was to weaken nationalism. I hope you are getting it. All those provisions of this constitutional development was actually a response of what? Response of the, the prevailing circumstances, right. So 1909 Act, there was no process, there was no growth of responsible government. Yes, indirect election, if you have to use the word, right, indirect election, this provision was there in 1909, but there was no territorial representation, there was class representation. And one important provision of 1909 Act was separate electorate, right, and as I mentioned, it weakened our nationalism, right. Then after 1909 Act, again there was a revival of nationalism, right, there was a demand of home rule. Then there was a, you can say, response also in 1917 that they are going to give us a responsible government. This kind of commitment, promise was made, and in that context you have 1919 Act. So again, what was the expectation in 1919 Act? Responsible government. What was the expectation in 1919 Act? Swaraj, right, whether we got this Swaraj, we got this responsible government. One answer is yes. Why? Because in 1919 Act you have the provision of direct election. You have this provision of direct election, right, particularly in provinces, right, you will see the direct election. And then of course you will see that now the subject divided into central, or you can say, and the provincial subject, and the provincial subject was also divided into transferred and reserved subject. We will call this kind of provision as diarchy, and this diarchy did not allow Swaraj. I hope you are getting it. So, direct election, so you will get the sense that yes, it is actually moving towards Swaraj, but no, it was not Swaraj. Why it was not Swaraj? Because the provincial subject was divided into two division, two categories, transferred and reserved subject. And right, as a minister you have the power, but you have the power, you can say, limited to what? Transferred subject, not reserved subject, right. So, I explained this in a separate video, concept of diarchy. So, diarchy did not allow responsible government, and then in 1919 Act, right, you have some more provision, like you have the provision of, right, you can say, right, Public Service Commission, you have the provision in 1919 Act, right, you can say the provision regarding the High Commissioner, right, you will see to assist Secretary of State. Then you have in 1919 Act the provincial budget, right. So, 1919 Act you have some of course some positive development, but the biggest defect of 1919 Act was diarchy in provinces, and it did not, you know, led to what? It did not lead to what? A provincial independence or provincial autonomy, right, what would be autonomy. Then after 1919 Act, the last constitutional, right, the development was 1935 Act, and in 1935 Act there was a concept of, actually they contemplated All India Federation. They talked about 3 lists, right. They talked about, you can say, provincial autonomy, because diarchy was abolished in provinces and it was replaced, you can say, at the central level. There was bicameralism even in the provinces. In 1919 Act it was only in the center. So, 1935 Act you will see, right, this kind of development. But 1935 Act is also known for different safeguard. 1935 Act is also known for extension, right, you can say, of the communal electorate. 1935 Act is also known for different kind of, you can say, indirect limitation on the legislating power. So, 1935 Act was also not actually a move towards responsible government, and therefore, right, our nationalists were not satisfied with even this 1935 Act. But yes, after this Act in 1937 they had to fight election, right. Then after 1935 Act, right, the last constitutional reform in this topic you will see 1947 Act. 1947 Act, you should remember, right, in the context of what? It was not actually, 1947 Act did not give a new constitution, try to understand it. It was an enabling act. It enabled the Constituent Assembly of India and Pakistan, two dominion, right, to develop their own constitution, right, you can say. So, 1947 Act was only an enabling act, right, and it actually started what? A new chapter, glorious chapter in the history of India after 1947, right. So, overall when you prepare this topic, of course in preliminary examination also, right, they can give you 2-3 provisions and they can ask you that these provisions are related to which act. So, in this topic we have to remember what? We have to remember 1858 Act, 1861 Act, 1892 Act, then 1909 Act, then 5th 1919 Act, then 6th 1935 Act, and then 7th 1947 Act. And if you remember these provisions, right, if you remember overall development, if you remember what exactly is the background of this act, right, we can handle most of the question, right, in general studies. Is this okay, right? So, we have to remember the provisions of this 1858 Act, right. So, what I said about 1858 Act, I said 1858 Act can be called what? Act for the good government of India. And who used this expression? If you will read Subhas Kashyap, he mentioned it, that the 1858 Act can be called what? It is called what? Act for the good government of India, and as Subhas Kashyap explicitly mentioned, that 1858 Act did not alter in any substantial way the system of government that prevailed in India, right. So, there was no substantial change in the system of government, right, in 1858 Act, but what changed? So, what changed? We can remember that the rule of the company was now replaced by the rule of the crown in India. The powers of the British crown now were to be exercised by the Secretary of State for India, and that Secretary of State would be a member of what? British cabinet, and he was assisted by the Council of India having what? 15 members. He was vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration through the Viceroy, and Viceroy would be an agent. So, what you have to remember, that now the Governor General was made the Viceroy of India, and who became the Viceroy of India? First Viceroy, Lord Canning, right. And then, as I mentioned, one more point you have to remember in 1858 Act, that it abolished both Board of Control and Court of Director, right. And when this system started, you remember Pitt's India Act, right. So, these provisions you have to remember in 1858 Act. Then second important act was what? Indian Council Act of 1861. So, Indian Council Act of 1861 is relevant. What all important point you have to remember here? So, we have to remember that in this act, for the purpose of legislation, the Viceroy's Executive Council was expanded. Some of the non-official seats, non-official, were offered to natives of the high rank. And if you can remember, 3 Indians now entered the Legislative Council. You will see the name of these 3 Indians: Raja of Banaras, Maharaja of Patiala, Sir Dinkar Rao. So, now, they entered the Legislative Council. Then this act also provided for the establishment of new Legislative Council for some provinces like Bengal, Northwestern Frontier Province and Punjab. And this act accorded statutory recognition to the portfolio system. This can be asked, which act introduced portfolio system? 1861 Act. So, what exactly is the portfolio system? A member of the Viceroy's Council, right, would be, you can say, made what? In charge of one or more department, right. So, this point you have to remember. And then I also mentioned that this act, 1861 Act, is also known for what? Initiating the process of decentralization by resorting or by restoring, you can say, the legislative power to Bombay and Madras provinces. And if you can remember one more point in 1861 Act, you have to remember that this act empowered the Viceroy to issue ordinances in cases of emergency, and the life of such an ordinance was 6 months, right. So, these points you have to remember related to 1861 Act. Then what was the third development after the establishment of Indian National Congress? Third development was Indian Council Act of 1892. What all you have to remember in 1892? It enlarged the size of the Legislative Council, right. It enlarged the function of the Legislative Council also, and now it gave them the power of what? Discussing the budget, power of what? Addressing question to the executive on matters of public interest, yes, after giving 6 days notice. And always remember, 1892 Act was criticized. When you will read your NCERT, right, even your history books, you will see that what was the demand? No taxation without representation. So, 1892 Act, right, was a very important development, right, you can say, for moderate, and it was criticized, but was, right, you can say, any improvement in this act? It was certainly an improvement on the 1861 Act, because it brought in a representative element in the Legislative Council. But the word election cannot be used, as I mentioned. The process was described as nomination made on the recommendation of certain bodies, right. So, if they ask you that whether the word election was used in 1892 Act, answer would be no, right. So, nomination process is started, Indians now involved, Then after 1892 Act, the next development I told you was Indian Council Act of 1909. Why there would be no progress regarding responsible government in 1909 Act? Because they weakened our nationalism, formation of Muslim League, Surat split, and therefore they were not ready to give us anything right regarding responsible government. What you have to remember regarding Indian Council Act of 1909, we have to remember that it was called what? Morley-Minto reforms. Right. We have to remember that this act, this 1909 Act, very important, recognized the principle of indirect election. Right. We have to remember that it changed, you can say the name. Now, Central Legislative Council was now, right, they started calling it Imperial Legislative Council. You have to remember that the member of the Central Legislative Council was increased from 16 to 60. Right. Then we have to remember that this Act, 1909 Act, introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. It was a negative development. What we have to remember that 1909 Act legalized communalism, right? Communalism, right? So communalism is what? It's an ideology based on religion, right? So communalism, now you will see that it will lead to what? Right, gradually what? A new kind of politics that will finally lead to partition. Okay. So this act legalized communalism, and then we have to remember one more point, if you can, that in this 1909 Act, Indians for the first time, right, you can say, entered in the Viceroy's Executive Council, and who was the first Indians? S.P. Sinha, right. So these points are general points, we have to remember these points. Then the next important development was, and very important development regarding responsible government, right, was Government of India Act of 1919. And Government of India Act of 1919 is also known as what? Montagu-Chelmsford reform, right, Montagu-Chelmsford reform. And in this act, as I said, one important, right, you can say, decision was that the central subjects were demarcated and separated from those of the provincial subject, and it further divided the provincial subject into two parts, transferred and reserved, and this system is called what? Diarchy, right. And this act introduced for the first time bicameralism at the center, upper house, lower house at the center. In this act, as I mentioned, that first time we will see direct election, and this act also required that the 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, other than Commander-in-Chief, were to be Indians. And this act provided for Public Service Commission. This act provided for what? Provincial budget, separated, you can say, from the central budget. And then this act also extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorate for Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indian and Europeans. And if you can remember, there was one more change in London. What? It created a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London to assist Secretary of State for India. So you will see that 1919 Act was a game changer, but whether it satisfied Indian nationalists, answer is no. And after 1919 Act, there was non-cooperation movement, right. So this act could not satisfy this nationalist, and what was the biggest defect of 1919 Act? Biggest defect of 1919 Act was provision of monarchy, right. Then the next important development, constitutional development, was Government of India Act of 1935 Act, right. So what we should remember in Government of India Act 1935 Act, right, 1935, we should remember that this act contemplated the establishment of all India Federation consisting of the provinces and the princely states as units, right. But as you all know that this federation, that this concept never came into being. This act also talked about 3 lists, and this act divided the powers between the center and the units into items of 3 lists, namely federal list, provincial list and the concurrent list. The federal list for the center consisted of 59 items, the provincial list for the provinces consisted of 54 items, and the concurrent list for both consisted of 36 items, right. If you can remember these facts, it is okay. Then you have to remember that the residuary powers were vested with the viceroy. This is interesting, and the act abolished diarchy in the provinces. It was the biggest development, and it introduced provincial autonomy. This is the most important feature of 1935 Act. But we have to remember that this act provided for the adoption of diarchy at the center, right. Then this act also introduced bicameralism in the provinces, 6 out of 11 provinces, right. And then this act, right, provided for a federal court, which later became what, Supreme Court, right. But you will use the word federal court. And one important development of this 1935 Act, if you remember 1858, there was a Council of India. So now in 1935 Act, this Council of India was abolished. So these provisions, these points you have to remember regarding 1935 Act. Then finally, Indian Independence Act of 1947. I told you that this Indian Independence Act of 1947 did not provide for any new constitution of India, right. It was only an act to enable the representatives of India and Pakistan to frame their own constitution. Is this okay? So what exactly it did? It declared India as an independent and sovereign state. It abolished the office of viceroy. It abolished the office of secretary of state. It proclaimed the lapse of what? British paramountcy over the Indian princely states, and it assigned dual function, you can say, to the Constituent Assembly, right. What kind of dual function? Constituent function and legislative function. And right, you can say now it declared the Dominion legislature as a sovereign body. So what finally we can say, that at the stroke of the midnight of 15th August 1947, the British rule came to an end. So 1947 Act closed a chapter, but you have to remember that it also opened a new chapter and a glorious chapter of free India, right. So I hope, right, these provisions, right, you can revise now properly. Thanks a lot.